I never raised my voice when they handed me the eviction notice. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I simply slid an old, weathered document across the table and watched the confidence drain from their faces. It was a water rights deed dated 1923, yellowed with age, but still legally alive. At that moment, 35 luxury homes that had been marketed as exclusive suburban living were quietly reclassified by reality itself. They were no longer premium properties. They were sitting directly in the path of water that had existed long before any of them were imagined. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm 34 years old, an engineer by profession, and a third-generation steward of 47 acres of Texas land just outside Austin. That land wasn't just property. It was history. It was my grandfather's life work, and it was nearly stolen while I was serving overseas. My grandfather, everyone called him Pops, bought the land in 1955. Back then, Austin wasn't a tech capital. It was quiet, dusty, and surrounded by ranches and small farms. Pops believed land wasn't something you conquered, it was something you took care of. In 1978, he built a modest earth dam on the property. Nothing flashy. Just solid engineering meant to capture rainwater for cattle and help regulate downstream flow during dry seasons. The dam wasn't a backyard project. Pops worked directly with federal engineers to design it properly. It passed every inspection for decades. It became part of the natural rhythm of the area, holding water when it was needed, releasing it when nature demanded balance. I grew up fishing near that dam, learning how water moves, how land breathes. That understanding followed me into adulthood and eventually into my military career. I served 2 tours overseas working on water infrastructure, wells, flood control, and emergency systems. War teaches you quickly how essential water is, and how ugly things become when it's controlled by the wrong people. While I was deployed during my second tour, Pops passed away. The land went into a family trust managed by my sister Sarah, who lives in California. She meant well, but she trusted a local land management company to handle everything. Taxes were paid automatically, paperwork filed without scrutiny, and that's where the door opened. A nearby luxury housing development, Willowbrook Estates, had been expanding aggressively. Their homeowners association, led by a woman named Margaret Thornwell, specialized in community beautification. In reality, that meant pressure, manipulation, and quietly absorbing land that didn't fit their suburban image. While I was overseas, Willowbrook filed an adverse possession claim on part of my family's land. They claimed it was abandoned and used, forgotten. Construction permits followed. Zoning changes passed quietly. And by the time I returned home in August 2023, survey stakes and concrete trucks were scattered across what had once been open pasture. I still remember the sound of gravel under my boots as I walked onto land I had known my entire life and was told it wasn't mine anymore. A foreman shrugged and said they had permits. The police arrived, uncomfortable but firm. On paper, the HOA had moved faster than the truth. Then I noticed something worse. Their crews had diverted the creek that fed Pop's dam. The water level was dropping daily. Decades of careful water management were being undone for decorative landscaping and profit. When I confronted Margaret, she smiled like she was doing me a favor. She told me the land was being put to better use. Then she added, quietly, that I should have stayed closer to home. That was the moment it stopped being a misunderstanding. I hired a lawyer and quickly learned how expensive justice can be when corruption wears a suit. While paperwork crawled through the system, I started digging on my own. County records, old permits, archive deeds. And buried deep in those records, I found something powerful. The dam wasn't just private property. It was federally documented infrastructure. That meant federal jurisdiction. And even more important, I uncovered my great-grandfather's 1923 senior water rights deed. It predated the city, the county, and every single home built downstream. They hadn't just taken land, they had stolen water, and water in Texas has memory. That realization changed everything. Once I understood what they had taken, I also understood how dangerous they were. People don't steal water by accident. They steal it because they believe no one will challenge them, or worse, because they believe the system will protect them. Willowbrook Estates didn't slow down after I returned. They sped up. Construction ran late into the night, floodlights burning like stadiums, concrete trucks rumbling past my farmhouse as if intimidation itself were a strategy. Every day, I documented the changes. The creek's altered path, the falling water levels, the unnatural dryness where life had once thrived. Margaret Thornwell, or Maggie as she liked to be called, began a public relations campaign. She framed herself as a concerned community leader, and me as an unstable outsider. She spoke softly in public, but every action she took was aggressive. HOA patrols appeared near my gate. Complaints were filed weekly: noise, livestock, building code violations on structures that had stood untouched for 60 years. Then came the inspections: building inspectors, fire safety officers, health department officials, all in a single week. Each visit produced small, expensive demands designed to bleed me financially. I recognized the tactic instantly. Overwhelm the target until resistance collapses. What I didn't expect was how far they go. One morning, a social worker showed up for a wellness check. Someone had claimed I was a troubled veteran struggling to reintegrate. It was humiliating. Not because the woman was unkind, she was professional and apologetic, but because Maggie stood nearby watching like she was inspecting livestock. That was when I realized this wasn't just a land grab. It was a coordinated campaign. While Maggie controlled the narrative locally, I expanded my reach quietly. I contacted an old friend from my service days, who now worked in environmental enforcement. One phone call changed everything. Diverting a natural waterway without federal clearance wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Potentially criminal. So I began documenting like an engineer and thinking like an investigator. Trail cameras, timestamp photos, flow measurements, soil samples. I tracked exactly how much water was being diverted and where it was going. The numbers were staggering. Over 1,000 gallons a day removed from a system that had supported downstream farms for generations. At the same time, I started meeting people. An elderly woman named Mrs. Chin showed me photos of her family's garden from the 1940s, fed by the same creek. Now the soil was cracked and lifeless. A farmer named Miguel Santos explained how his family had lost crops 2 seasons in a row after the diversion. These weren't coincidences. They were consequences, and then the pressure escalated. The city announced an eminent domain hearing. Public safety concerns, they said. My property was being labeled a hazard. The offer they made me was laughable, a fraction of the land's true value. The message was clear: sell cheap or lose everything. Local media joined in. Headlines questioned my stability. Anonymous sources described me as aggressive and unpredictable. It was propaganda, pure and simple. And it worked at first, but the truth has a way of surfacing. While Maggie was staging photo ops with worried parents, I uncovered something critical. The entire Willowbrook development sat in a historically recognized floodplain. Insurance companies had originally refused coverage. The solution? Divert the creek and pretend the flood risk no longer existed. That wasn't just negligence. It was fraud. Insurance applications contained false statements. Environmental assessments were manipulated. Permits were filed retroactively. And buried in public records, I discovered Maggie's previous HOA in another city had faced massive penalties for an identical scheme. This was a pattern. With help from an environmental attorney named Amanda Cross, I connected the dots. Maggie's husband, a local official, had financial ties to the construction company. Zoning changes were rushed through while I was overseas. Oversight reports vanished. Investigations stalled. Every layer peeled back revealed another. And then we found the Covenant.A, an original agricultural flood management agreement tied directly to Pop's Dam. The language was clear. The dam operator was obligated to maintain natural seasonal flow patterns to protect downstream water rights. That meant the diversion wasn't just illegal, it violated a standing legal duty. At the same time, environmental damage reports surfaced. Fish populations collapsed. Protected bird habitats vanished. The ecosystem was unraveling because someone wanted prettier landscaping. By the time federal agencies took interest, Maggie was panicking. She offered money. She threatened lawsuits. She tried to contact my family directly. Nothing worked. The system she trusted was starting to turn on her. And that's when I realized something crucial. I didn't need to destroy anything. I just needed to let the water go where it had always belonged. By the time autumn clouds began gathering over the hills, the conflict had outgrown court filings and zoning hearings. This was no longer a quiet legal dispute. It had become a full-scale pressure campaign, and every day I could feel the clock ticking. Willowbrook Estates was racing against reality. Construction accelerated. Crews worked weekends. Trucks lined the access roads. They weren't just building homes. They were trying to lock in permanence. Once families moved in, once mortgages were signed, once the narrative shifted from development to community, they believed the land and water would be theirs by default. But water doesn't care about paperwork. Behind the scenes, Amanda Cross was assembling something far more dangerous than a lawsuit. She coordinated complaints across multiple agencies: environmental protection, insurance regulation, banking oversight. Each complaint alone might have taken years to resolve. Together, they created pressure from every direction. Meanwhile, I focused on what I knew best: engineering and preparation. I revisited Pop's original dam plans in detail. The structure wasn't just an earthen wall holding water. It was a carefully designed flood management system with an emergency spillway meant to restore natural flow during high-volume events. The spillway hadn't been used in decades, but it had been built to last. When I inspected it closely, I felt a strange sense of calm. The mechanisms were intact. The math still worked. The land still remembered what water was supposed to do. What disturbed me most wasn't the dam. It was what Willowbrook had built downstream. Several homes sat directly in the creek's historic channel. Others had foundations lower than the seasonal high-water mark. Decorative stone features masked structural weaknesses. Everything looked beautiful, until you imagined actual water moving through it. This wasn't just greed. It was reckless ignorance. As the city pushed forward with the eminent domain hearing, Maggie escalated her harassment campaign. HOA members parked near my property daily, filming, taking notes, calling authorities over imagined violations. Noise complaints when I ran farm equipment. Environmental hazards. Reports over livestock that had been there for decades. The most disturbing move came when a coordinated group of inspectors arrived on the same day. Each cited small, costly issues. None alone would shut me down. Together, they were meant to break me. But something unexpected happened. The community began to push back. Miguel Santos introduced me to other farmers who'd quietly lost access to water over the years. Mrs. Chen connected me with longtime residents who remembered the creek's original path. Photos surfaced. Old maps appeared. Stories aligned. This wasn't nostalgia. It was evidence. At the same time, Amanda uncovered fraudulent claims tied to the HOA's insurance coverage. The development's loans were backed by guarantees of permanent water diversion, guarantees they had no legal right to make. If those water rights reverted to their rightful owner, the entire financial structure collapsed. That's when Maggie started offering money. First, it was an insultingly low number. Then more. Then urgency. Deadlines. Pressure. Silence followed by threats. She was trying to buy certainty before the truth surfaced. But the final push came from the weather. Meteorologists predicted the heaviest seasonal rains in years. Naturally occurring, predictable, and unavoidable. If the creek remained blocked, uncontrolled flooding would occur elsewhere, potentially causing real damage. But if the spillway was used properly, water would return safely to its natural course. That's when I understood my responsibility. This wasn't about revenge or exposure. It was about prevention. Amanda filed emergency motions asserting my legal obligation to restore natural flow under the original covenant. Federal agencies scheduled site inspections. Environmental groups expressed interest. Reporters began asking real questions, and Maggie made her biggest mistake. Her crews began pouring permanent concrete barriers into the original creek bed. That wasn't just illegal. It was irreversible. That act alone justified intervention. I calculated volumes carefully. Recent rainfall had filled the reservoir beyond seasonal averages. The spillway could release water gradually, safely, and legally. Every step was documented. Every calculation backed by decades of data. We posted warnings. Notified local services. Informed downstream landowners. Transparency became our shield. At night, I stood near the spillway controls, listening to the wind move through the grass. Pop's old journal sat beside me. One entry stood out more than the rest. Water doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. That was the moment I knew. The system hadn't failed. It had been abused. And abuse ends when someone finally says no. The rain clouds were coming. So was the truth. The night before the spillway operation felt unreal. The air was heavy, thick with the promise of rain. Every sound carried farther than usual. Insects, distant engines, the low rustle of wind moving through dry grass that hadn't felt real moisture in far too long. I didn't sleep. Instead, I reviewed plans again and again. Flow rates, timing, safety margins. Everything had to be precise. This wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a statement for social media. It was a controlled restoration of something that had been stolen, and it had to be done right. Maggie sensed what was coming. Her behavior shifted from calculated confidence to frantic aggression. She hired private security to protect the community, positioning them near my property under the pretense of public safety. In reality, they were there to intimidate and interfere. That night, my trail cameras caught them attempting sabotage. Two figures moved toward the spillway controls under cover of darkness. One carried a bag of fast-setting concrete. They tried to jam the hydraulic system, likely hoping to create a dangerous failure scenario they could blame on me. They didn't succeed. Law enforcement was already alerted. The arrest happened quietly, but the message was loud. Maggie's campaign had crossed from harassment into criminal interference. The following morning, she went public. On local television, she painted herself as a protector of families and children. She spoke of fear, of danger, of a disturbed individual using technical knowledge irresponsibly. It was emotional, polished, and completely disconnected from reality. But reality was arriving faster than her narrative could keep up. Federal investigators arrived just after sunrise. Environmental officials, engineers, and inspectors walked the site calmly, professionally. They reviewed documents. They examined the dam. They traced the creek's original path using historical maps and physical markers still etched into the land. At 7:02 a.m., with witnesses present and documentation rolling, I opened the spillway gates to partial capacity. The sound wasn't violent. It was gentle. A steady release. Water moving the way it had always moved. Willow Creek began flowing through its original channel, bypassing illegal barriers and ignoring decorative landscaping that had no business controlling it. Within minutes, the truth was visible. And homes flooded. No chaos erupted. The water stayed where history said it would. Downstream, dry channels filled naturally. Stocked ponds replenished. Gardens drank for the first time in over a year. Miguel Santos stood silently near the restored flow, tears cutting lines through dust on his face. Mrs. Chen dipped her fingers into the water and smiled softly, like greeting an old friend. Maggie lost control. She shouted. She accused. She demanded arrests. She live-streamed her meltdown, repeating words like terrorism and attack. But cameras don't lie. The water told a different story. Reporters asked questions she couldn't answer. Why was the creek blocked in the first place? Why did historical maps show homes built directly in a flood channel? Why had environmental permits never been filed? Meanwhile, the consequences multiplied. Insurance regulators issued immediate stop-work orders. Banks froze construction financing. Environmental agencies documented wildlife loss tied directly to the diversion. Every lie Maggie depended on began collapsing simultaneously. Then came Rick. Her husband arrived furious, shouting into his phone, threatening officials, demanding action. His arrogance betrayed him. His recorded words revealed financial motives and political interference. He could no longer deny. By noon, the development was effectively shut down. The water continued flowing, calm, consistent, undeniable. Attempts to interfere only made things worse. Concrete trucks sent to block the creek were stopped and cited. Interfering with a federal environmental investigation isn't a civil issue. It's criminal. The crowd shifted. Some HOA residents quietly left. Others watched in silence, realizing they'd been sold a lie. This wasn't a dangerous flood. It was restoration. By afternoon, the narrative had flipped completely. Community reclaims stolen water. Environmental restoration exposes development fraud. Veteran engineer restores historic creek. Maggie vanished before the press could corner her. The land didn't celebrate. It simply breathed. And for the first time in months, the creek sounded alive again. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt heavier than noise. Not the tense silence of fear, but the kind that comes when everyone in the room understands something irreversible has happened. The truth had arrived, and no amount of money, power, or performance could push it back. Maggie arrived dressed for sympathy. Black suit, pearls, carefully controlled expressions. Her legal team filled an entire row, armed with binders and experts ready to reframe reality. On the opposite side sat farmers, environmental advocates, longtime residents, and federal officials who had already seen enough. Amanda Cross stood calm and unshaken. The hearing didn't begin with emotion. It began with documents. Historical maps. Federal permits. Water rights deeds older than the city itself. One by one, the illusion of legitimacy surrounding Willowbrook Estates was dismantled. Federal investigators testified first. The creek diversion violated multiple environmental protections. Wildlife loss was documented. Insurance applications were proven fraudulent. Banking regulations had been breached. This wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. Then came testimony from the community. Miguel Santos spoke about losing crops his family had grown for generations. Mrs. Chen showed photographs of her garden before and after the diversion. Their words didn't accuse. They explained. That made them impossible to dismiss. When Maggie took the stand, the performance returned. She spoke of fear, of instability, of danger. She pointed at me and tried to turn restoration into threat. But facts don't respond to fear. When recording surfaced, her husband discussing zoning manipulation, insurance deception, and financial gain, the room shifted. The judge didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. By the end of the day, every emergency order against me was dismissed. Interference with the spillway was prohibited. Federal investigations expanded. The system that had protected Maggie finally stopped working. The consequences were swift. Rick Thornwell resigned within days. Federal charges followed. Maggie's financial empire unraveled under civil penalties she couldn't outrun. Construction halted permanently. The HOA dissolved. Insurance coverage vanished, and Willow Creek kept flowing. Months later, the land looked different, not developed, but alive. Native grasses returned. Birds nested where concrete had been planned. Fish populations rebounded faster than experts predicted. Nature doesn't hesitate when given the chance. The community changed too. Former HOA residents joined restoration efforts. What had been sold to them as exclusivity was replaced by stewardship. Walking trails replaced fences. Children played near the creek instead of avoiding it. Miguel's farm recovered. Mrs. Chen's garden bloomed again. Water restored more than crops. It restored trust. My own life settled into something quieter, steadier. Pop's farmhouse was renovated sustainably. The dam remained, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as what it had always been, a tool for balance. Amanda and I stayed connected. Fighting corruption together tends to do that. The case spread beyond our valley. Environmental groups used it as precedent. Communities across the state challenged illegal diversions. Agencies updated enforcement guidelines, all because someone refused to let water be stolen quietly. Every evening, I walk down to the creek and listen. Water doesn't brag. It doesn't demand credit. It just moves forward, carrying history with it. That's the lesson Pops left behind. Land isn't owned. It's protected. Water isn't controlled. It's respected. And communities don't survive because of power. They survive because people stand up together. Willow Creek flows free now, and it always will.